just transition for the poor. This comes on the eve of the conclusion of COP27, where key decisions have been made. We have a fundamental decision on loss and damage, which is basically targeting to support the most vulnerable communities in least developing countries. But Africa, as many other developing regions, is faced with a number of challenges, a lot of global challenges, from COVID-19 and of course to climate change and disaster risk phenomena. And all these challenges are becoming more complex. They're becoming more uncertain in terms of how they manifest and in terms of how they affect the most vulnerable segments of the community. Indeed, there has been a lot of efforts by African governments, the stakeholders, the researchers, the different groups of people who have made enormous efforts to be able to support the continent in responding to some of these challenges. But one question that remains, in these responses, are our communities becoming better or are they becoming worse? These are the questions that are fundamental for the continent.
The ARIN network is a consortium of over 200 researchers, policymakers, technocrats from across Africa, and currently we are spread in over 36 countries in Africa with national focal points present in each of those countries. ARIN's aim is to promote research in science and policy based on evidence. Every year, the ARIN network organizes the ARIN International Conference, which brings together researchers and policymakers from across the world to discuss the implication of global challenges on the African continent and come up with possible solutions of responding to these challenges in an inclusive and sustainable way. The ARIN International Conference 2022 will be a 3-day virtual event held on Zoom. The theme for the first day will be envisioning a just transition for Africa. And on the second day, we'll be talking about building just and resilient community systems in Africa. And finally, we will close the conference with decolonizing policy research towards resilient communities in Africa. But as if that is not enough, we have lined up interesting side events for you during this conference period, and you can find them on our website. The conference will be taking place from the 7th of December to the 9th of December 2022 from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. East African time, and the side events will be from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. East African time.
Thank you very much for listening to that short video that is introducing the entire conference and also what ARIN is all about. Again, welcome to the session. I see more people joining in from very different parts. And as we keep joining in, I can see the chat, a lot of text and introductions. So feel free to just type in where you're joining us from. Just introduce yourself a little bit, your name and your affiliation, and maybe contact details and how to connect with you, because of course the main reason we're here is to connect and learn from each other. So thank you for doing that already. My name is Victoria Chengo. I am a research fellow at the Africa Research and Impact Network, and I will be your chair for today. So just to continue, I hope you enjoyed that video that was introducing the session. So I can see our speakers have joined, and I really, really thank you for being here. So I'm going to share my screen just in a little bit. Yes, so as has been highlighted in the video, the ARIN conference generally is looking at how to rebuild better and resilient communities through a just transition in Africa, and very importantly, looking at what the just concluded Conference of Parties had to offer. And just as we have been listening in from other sessions, because this is the final day of the conversations. So from the day one, we were trying to look at how to envision what a just transition is for Africa. And here we were looking at some of the fundamental elements that underpin what a just transition in Africa is. And here we looked at some of the examples of some of organizations and how other countries in some of the countries in Africa are trying to do this and trying to reflect on the outcomes of the Conference of Parties. And from day one, I think what came out as very important is definition that a just transition is context specific. It is not really just trying to just define it in an overall sense, but we have to contextualize this to get its meaning and what it means. And here we found that it is really key to develop some of the metrics that could address some of the diverse local communities across the continents. On day 2, which is yesterday, we were looking at how to build resilient community systems. And here we were looking at the implications of the transition processes on local community systems, especially the vulnerable and marginalized groups. And as it came up actually in one of the sessions today, because we had also side events, there was a question about who are the vulnerable and marginalized groups and how do we define this? So that is really key. And we also tried to look at some of the processes or interventions of pursuing a just transition in response to some of these interruptions that have been coming up on and affecting the vulnerable communities. And of course, at the top of the agenda is climate change. And from these discussions on day two, we found that it is really important to build stronger connections between research, policy, and the community systems, and also incorporating traditional knowledge in terms to build sustainable and resilient communities. And also it came out very clear that communities need to be part of the decision-making processes and not just as victims of how decisions are made. So we have recordings of these 2 sessions already that have been shared. I'm sure you have received a copy of or a link to the YouTube recordings, and we shall be also happy to share the findings of the discussion today. So in today's session, we want to look at the 3rd theme, which is decolonizing the policy research towards now the resilience communities. And what we want to do is to explore some of the pathways for decolonizing some of the research and policies that could support resilient communities, and to understand some of the underlying drivers of the knowledge, the resource, and institutional coloniality that reinforce the vulnerabilities. So without taking too much time, I want us to just go straight into the sessions. We're going to have a panel discussion, and then we are going to listen to some of the case studies of some of the work that has been done. And I think this is through a book chapter that has been put together. And before we go into the panel sessions, we're going to just listen to keynote addresses from some of renowned kind of experts in this area. And the first person we're going to listen to, and I'm really, really glad that Professor Andy Starling could join us, because he's really has been looking at this topic over years and has written extensively, published extensively about this topic. And Professor Andy Starling is a professor of science and technology policy at the University of Sussex. He has, over the years, co-directed the STEP Center, which concluded, I think, early last year, and has been working on issues of power, uncertainty, and diversity in science and technology, especially on energy and biotechnology. So without taking so much time and talking too much, allow me to really welcome Professor Andy Starling, joining us from the University of Sussex to give us a keynote address and looking at how we can decolonize some of this policy research. So really welcome, Professor Starling.
Victoria, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And it's such a huge pleasure to be here with everyone with so many familiar faces. I wish I were there in Nairobi, but I guess most of us are probably not there, but I do wish I was with you and we could talk informally about these things. I'll go straight to it. Oh, I think I can't share my screen while the other sharing is going on. Thank you. So yes, here's my topic. Decolonizing knowledge for sustainability transformations. And it follows from that really nice summary you gave of this extremely important conference. I hope the issues I'll sketch here briefly will be useful as a way of building on those very firm foundations. What I'm going to be looking at are what comes with the territory, literally the territory of the topic I've been given of decolonizing knowledge, the deeply, very deeply, sometimes invisibly deep ways in which coloniality shapes even the content of science, not just knowledge in general, but natural science as well, when it's looking at challenges of justice, of climate, of resilience. And in short, despite the best of intentions, despite completely inadvertently and unconsciously even, the content of knowledge can be warped by privilege and by power. And that's what I want to really outline, ways in which we can challenge that together. Well, to start with, why do we need to be using this language of decolonizing knowledge for sustainability transitions? It may seem quite an unfamiliar, quite a politicized kind of language. Some people working in the natural sciences, for instance, may be understandably cautious about this kind of normative take. But I just want to start by reminding us that the reason we're in this position is because sustainability is big. It's not controversial to look at the aims around the eradication of hunger, the ending of climate disruption, the challenging of inequalities of race and gender, the reversing of inequalities of race and gender, to, in the words of the UN, end poverty in all its forms everywhere, to leave no one behind. These are radical ambitions, and the scope of these aims extends beyond what government or markets or finance or innovation or infrastructure or any of the usual foci of our work on resilience and transformation and sustainability usually look at. They go beyond sectors, they go beyond policy mixes. Because the drivers of these underlying challenges are bigger even than capitalism, and capitalism itself is so rarely addressed. It's a little phrase we share sometimes, isn't it? That it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism somehow in our field. And yet the challenges clearly are bigger than capitalism, because these challenges exist and existed outside capitalism. So the challenges we're facing then are so big that even the name is unfamiliar for the formations that are responsible for them. And this name, I think we can name it as we like, but the name colonial modernity gets to the nub of what are the processes that have led to such severe injustice, such devastating environmental destruction around the world. Because alongside all the good in modernity, we've seen 500 years of globalizing imaginations and institutions for control, for stratifying people, for appropriating property, for extracting resources, for accumulating wealth, and for concentrating power. And a clue to the importance of decolonizing knowledge then lies in the rarity with which this rather obvious framing is in fact brought to the fore. Although decolonizing research for decolonizing various things is very prominent, and rightly so, it's less so in relation to sustainability and resilience challenges and climate challenges, where we speak of justice rather than decolonization. And the shaping and the bounding of these understandings of the challenge itself is a crucial block. Here's an example of how the content of knowledge can constrain our understanding of the kinds of actions that are needed. So in short then, if the challenge is indeed, as the United Nations has emphasized with all the authority and scope of the voices behind it, that this is about transforming our world, then this has to mean decolonizing governance, culture, knowledge, and modernity itself. Now, at this point, it can't have escaped people's attention, I think, that there's a bit of an elephant in the room. Indeed, it's a white elephant, it's me. Because when you see the messenger, a great honor as it is for me to be here talking of these issues, and thank you for this invitation, but an old, white, heterosexual, middle-class, globally northern Anglophone man being the messenger, then we see how these structures. It's an example, a fairly graphic one, of how the structures of privilege shape even the critique. Despite intentions, despite commitments, that is something that is unavoidable in the world. And so we need to recognize this, we need to call it out, and we need to use it against itself. So here, I don't know what people think about this, but I regard my task under these circumstances is not to seek to represent any of the many interests and voices whose experience of coloniality is so much more acute than my own. But I'm merely, as Victoria said in the introduction, trying to be accountable for the lessons that I've learned in my own tiny struggle over the last 30 years to use the colonial privileges of the kind I've just mentioned, which I have contingently benefited from, to help disrupt upwards, to help open up colonial power, to help strive to make more political space. But in doing this, it really, the first and foremost lesson and message in this task, I think, is the biggest contradiction with my own role, which is the necessity to equalize knowledge, to equalize the attention and the framing of knowledge is by different races, by Black and brown people, by different genders, by people from different geographies, north and south, by different languages other than the one that we are all speaking for colonial reasons. So decolonizing understandings of sustainability transformations means paying respect and attention and equal space for the many burgeoning voices that address these issues that I indicate indicatively in some of the books I've shown on this slide. So my final slide then is to try to directly address the challenge I've been given of identifying pathways for decolonizing research, policy, and expertise. And my first point in this regard is that actually, I think it is part of the decolonizing challenge to move away from the idea of mapping an entire landscape, a territory again, if you like, but instead to think about compasses. The idea of mapping territory to appropriate and claim it is indeed itself a colonial ambition. But to have a compass to guide one in the far more unknown and contingent circumstances of struggle against power and privilege is maybe a better metaphor. So what then might our compass show as the first steps along such pathways, where the pathways themselves may be far more unknown than typical transitions thinking emphasizes? And I think one of those messages to remind ourselves that transformations of the scope and scale and depth that we're speaking of are more about politics and culture than policy or research. Policy and research fulfill vital and honorable roles when they're oriented in the right way, but they are secondary. They only work when they are following and driven by collective action, which has always been the origins of sustainability struggles on justice, on an environment, the problems, the identification of the problems, as well as the pioneering formulation of solutions to those problems have all come from social movements, civil society, before they were picked up by previously skeptical academia, business, and government. It's about values, how values frame science and evidence, that the science and evidence will speak with different voices depending on the values that often in a hidden way frame them. So I show this picture then of a murmuration, because I think it contains a very potent metaphor, rather than the kind of ballistic projectile pathways often projected by transitions research, as if we know more than we do about the transitions we're going to. The idea of a murmuration is quite potent. It's about horizontal coordination. It also means, in English at least, suppressed dissent, as well as its exquisitely choreographed mutualistic movement that we see in animals in nature. And when the time is right, a murmuration will change direction very, very quickly and very profoundly. So in this then, the medium is the message. So often in research, we think that action is impossible unless it's based on knowledge. Well, knowledge is crucial, but it is often the case that action shapes knowledge as the other way around. And knowledge itself is often important, not because it informs action, but because it is itself a kind of action. Activist scholarship has shown that again and again. So then I think there's a need to go beyond partnerships, to speak of openly and challengingly about equality and democracy in research and policymaking, a language that's often not used, and by democracy, a very itself corroded term in many ways, but it's worth trying to reclaim that term. meaning access by the least powerful to the capacities for challenging power, especially in its deepest, in other words, its colonial forms. So I think then, and I stand to be corrected on this, but it means looking beyond notions of stability and status quo that often, despite best intentions, lie behind resilience work, returning to the conditions ex ante, or of climate, maintaining global temperatures over the long period when climate itself is dynamic, instead having societies that can respond to dynamism rather than impose a static colonial aspiration on the entire world. Moving from stratified categories of natural, scientific, or social concept to a focus on relations and processes, maybe moving away a bit from the domination of scale-based thinking, multi-level governance, which are projections of hierarchical colonial societies onto a world which is in fact far less scaled than it is rhizomically interconnected at different levels. Moving away from the singularizing language of the transition or the nexus, that singularizing the at the beginning being, and again, the essence of the colonial ambition to unify and integrate into a single thing. The language of managing, as if the politics is airbrushed out, the planetary control variables, with that notion that there are such things as control variables in the world, being another projection of this colonial imagination of modernity. So in a way, this means then being a bit more positive, moving from imaginations and practices of control to care, greater humility about uncertainty. No matter how profoundly committed we are, that does not make us certain epistemically. Taking seriously the diversity, the radical diversity of contexts, of values, of understandings, of methods, of disciplines, of options, irreducible diversities, which are more political than they are often treated as being. Presenting the advice from our research, not in singular recommendations, but in a plural and conditional way, being explicit and honest about how different assumptions in our models lead to different conclusions, rather than feeling forced to speak to the global cockpit with a singular dashboard of truth. This means opening up then, by behaving in this way as privileged researchers, we help to open up this more liberatory political space for other voices to themselves challenge coloniality in the ways that only they know is best. So it means moving from fear-based motivations around sustainability and resilience and climate to hope for what a better future might look like. Moving from hierarchy to mutualism in the kinds of actions we undertake, from notions of growth to notions of flourishing and well-being in the aims that we highlight. From calculation to precaution. Calculation is crucial, but there is no quantification that does not first have to have categories. So narratives and interpretation are fundamental. Quantities follow from that. And sometimes it's the other way around in terms of the prestige in policy and in academia. From singularity to plurality in how we justify positions. From superiority to equality in understandings, not least in relations between, as we've heard from Victoria, expertise and indigenous knowledge of different kinds. So that's my best shot. These are the first steps, I would say, that I've learned in an imperfect way and only a partial account of ways in which we can hope and struggle to decolonize knowledge, to do justice to the challenge of truly transforming our world. And thanks a lot for giving me the space to say those things.
Fantastic. Always a pleasure and quite intriguing to listen to Professor Annie Sterling talking about the pathways of decolonizing research and the centrality of sustainability and the drivers, of opening up, closing in, and this single uncertainty. Really, it's really not easy to speak about this topic after Professor Annie Sterling has talked about this, and I really hope that you have enjoyed that keynote speech, and I really like the way Professor Sterling has talked about what some of the pathways that we want to look at, and how do we want to look at sustainability as a collective action. I really hope that we can get this presentation, Professor, so we can share with others. I'm sure everybody would want to just look at this very keenly and listen to you again and again as we're going to share this recording of your presentation. Thank you so much for that, Professor Sterling. We really appreciate. So without taking much of talking too much after that keynote speech, I want to take us now on to the next session, where we are going to have a really intriguing set of panelists trying to look at now this space of decolonizing policy research. And we want to focus our questions on just 3 specific questions. I want to, not really questions, because this set of panelists have come prepared. And we want to look at how to decolonize expertise in the global knowledge on resilience. We want to also look at how to decolonize answers and propel resilience. And we want to look at, thirdly, decolonizing policy and research for poor resilience. And just to help us look at some of those discourses, we're going to have our moderator, who I'm going to just usher in just right away, who is Dr. Joel Onyango, who is now the head of the Climate Resilient Economies program at the African Center for Technology Studies. He has worked extensively in this area, and he has published and worked and has a very passionate interest on the topic of decoloniality. So let me just allow our moderator, who is going to welcome a very interesting set of panelists and help us delve into those questions. So welcome, Dr. Onyango.
Thanks a lot, Vicky, and thank you so much, Andy. It's good to see you here again in this conversation about knowledge and learning system and decoloniality. It's often a wonderful field to listen to, both from the system side of things when you're talking about decoloniality, knowledge systems, learning, and pathways of doing so. Really stimulating conversation when you're talking about knowledge and learning systems. We'll now get into, I think, the crux of the works and start thinking about how we continue with this conversation in decolonizing perspectives. With us, I think we have several panelists. We have David. We also have Fatima, Faith, is it? Faith or Fatim? We have Sue, Maggie, and of course, Dr. Taylor, who will also be sharing their views. So without a lot of back and forth, I really invite people to share their comments, their views about especially what Andy has discussed, questions, and you can have that conversation in the chat. But I'd like to first start by inviting David Phillips. Dr. Phillips is an assistant vice president of research, strategy, and impact in the Office of Research Services Division, the network director for research and impact in Canada, and has done a lot of work around knowledge mobilization and research impact strategies. David, if you're here, please, we'll start with you in starting this conversation. As Victoria said, it's not about the questions, it's about the conversation and the theme of it. But what role can equitable partnerships play in decolonizing research? And of course, policy towards this whole strengthening resilience and strengthening how we bounce back out of things. Over to you, David.
Great, thank you very much, Joel. Thank you to the Africa Research and Impact Network for this invitation. I've just got a few minutes of my opening remarks, and I do appreciate this opportunity. My name is David Phipps. I'm a settler in Canada, born to white parents in England, and we emigrated to this land that some people call Canada when I was 2 years old. I live with my husband in Toronto, which is on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis, and the current treaty holders are the Mississaugas of the Credit. And as Joel said, I am the Assistant Vice President, Research Strategy and Impact at York University, and I am the Network Director for a network that is starting to look at a collaboration with ARIN. We call ourselves Research Impact Canada, 23 universities who are building institutional capacity to support research impact. And also at York University, I'm working with Indigenous Council to decolonize research at the university, and have held the pen on the Decolonizing Research Action Plan. Decolonizing is becoming a contested word among Indigenous scholars, especially when we think of institutions like a university. Can we really decolonize a university that is steeped in colonial practices and is funded and evaluated and governed according to colonial and Western ways of thinking and being? I use the term decolonizing But in my work at York, I am approaching this by removing systemic, removing systemic barriers to the authentic engagement of Indigenous scholarship and Indigenous scholars. And there's very little Indigenous scholarship that isn't engaged with Indigenous communities. And increasingly, the expectations of Indigenous research is that it will be indeed Indigenous-led, community-led research. An example of this is the framework we call OCAP, which is ownership, control, access, and possession, a framework for guiding research with First Nations communities in Canada, not Inuit or Métis, but First Nations. And for example, you could be working with a First Nations community for 3 years, and at the end of the day, they own the data and they say, you cannot publish on this, and that has to be okay. And within the university, we then have to be able to recognize the effort of a researcher that is gone towards scholarship that may not be reflected in traditional publications. At York University and at Research Impact Canada, we're focused on research partnerships as one way to increase the community access to research and to researchers. I think of a good partnership as being one that is authentic. In New York University's Knowledge Mobilization Unit, we break down traditional power structures and balance power between community and academic partners. And we do this in a few ways. First off, we've got a dedicated unit to do this. The institution is invested in 2 full-time staff and operating funds. We work for the community as much as we work for the university. We're the place where the community can pull out research rather than the university having to push it out. We're the place that you can approach with an idea for research. You've got a research question. We'll help you frame that question as in terms of research. And we're the ones that are going to find and broker the relationship with the right researcher, the one who respects the complementary expertise that is in lived experience or in the community setting. And we help researchers craft their grant applications so that they can actually share funding with community. For example, in one grant that I wrote to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, excuse me, it was a $93,000 grant, but because we had put our community partner as a co-applicant, I was able to move $75,000 to the community, and they could hire the capacity and community to do the work rather than me hiring students on the campus to do the work. So our role is to break down these traditional power structures. And when we're working with, we do this when we're working with Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. Is this decolonizing? I mean, maybe it is, I'm not certain, but we are shifting that power so that community is engaged as equals with our researchers, not as tokenistic collaborators. And I use the word collaborator specifically because in our grant applications, collaborator is less important than a partner. And I've got 6 things to leave with you to say, what do you need to enable this? 1, you need leadership. Our first vice president of research at the university was an educational psychologist. His research was in the classroom, seeking to get better educational outcomes for kids. And he felt research had to leave the university in order to make a difference. This work should be in the institution's policy and planning documents. If it's not in your plan, you're not going to liberate resources. And for things like career assessment, we can be guided by the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, or DORA. We like to celebrate success and encourage peer leadership. So researchers will listen to other researchers more than they're going to listen to me as the administrator. So we use those who are already doing this exciting work to encourage it elsewhere. We don't have a lot of internal funding, but we do help our researchers attract external funding. The 5th one is training. We've got a program called Mobilize YU, Mobilize York University, and that's based on tools and available expertise. And then the final one is we celebrate this work with awards. So we've got institutional awards. So I'm working in a Canadian context, but I learn from examples around the world. I'm involved with the Association of Commonwealth Universities, and I know there's many promising practices in the global south that I can learn and bring back from Canada to help our researchers who are working with their local and global communities. So thank you for this opportunity to share, but also more importantly, an opportunity for me to learn.
Really, thank you, David, for bringing that up. I'm hearing institutionalization. I'm hearing the opportunity for us to embed this area of thought, in terms of what we are doing, embedding it in that. And I like the fact that you're looking at this from a different terminology, sort of counter-systemic barriers, because these things have been embedded in our systems, including our philosophical way of doing things and doing research. So thinking about it in that context is very important. I wanted to bring on board also Maggie to help us respond to this question as well. Maggie, in your own experience, looking at this space when you're talking about, decoloniality, what do you think equitable partnerships play? What is the role of equitable partnerships in this space in terms of research and policy and strengthening local resilience? Maggie,
Thanks, Joel. Good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here. I have to say that speaking about after Andy and David are very difficult acts to follow, so I will try to do my best. And I want to acknowledge that also I come from a very different perspective from Andy, for instance. So in Andy's presentation, I wrote down that we have to go beyond partnerships, that decolonization is about politics, culture, equality, and democracy. And I totally agree with that. However, as to where I'm coming from, I'm director of UK CDR, which is a collaborative on development research. And we do work with the funders, with the research funders in the UK who have an interest in development research. So we work with UKRI, the Research and Innovation Agency. We work with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, FCDO, Department of Health, Department of Industrial Strategy, and also the Wellcome Trust. So the work UK CDR has been doing on equitable partnership come very much from a different angle. And from my personal background, I spent almost a so working in academia, working with academics, trying to set up international collaboration, responding to large challenge-led research. And I think in that capacity, I've seen very much firsthand the disparity, when you support an academic PI and when you work with colleagues in Africa, for instance, the support that the British PI gets, that is not to the same level as a support that a PI in Kenya or in South Africa, for instance, would be. And that to me was my first real understanding of the power imbalance that exists in research. So to come back to UK CDR, we are very much in the business of providing our funders with data, tools, and analysis for them to make evidence-informed decision. And in that respect, because our vision is to make knowledge work for global development, we have been looking over the past few years at the topic of equitable partnership. This has become a topic of interest to international research funders with an interest in development research. And we came together to reflect on the topic and to produce a good practice guidance document that I will share in the chat later in collaboration with Essence on Health. And what we did, and I completely acknowledge that equitable partnership is not the answer to decolonization, but I think it is a stepping stone. And with funders, stepping stone like equitable partnership is a good thing to highlight, and how we could move towards equity in partnership. So now you're going to tell me that the topic of equitable partnership has been dealt with for years, and yet we're still here today discussing it, and how can we bring more equity in research partnerships. So I think what we've done that is a bit different from existing literature is we are providing the community with very practical recommendations that have been informed by the funders themselves. And we have been working on 4 different approaches, and that basically look at the ecosystem from a very top level, and we drill down to the very nitty-gritty of what it actually means to really set up equitable partnership. So I won't give you a detailed description of what we've done, but for instance, when we start at the research partnership ecosystem level, it's just bringing to the attention of the funders, but also of the institution and the academics themselves, the value mindset. You have to value equity in research partnership to hope that it will change, and we will reach that point where we can call research partnership equitable. But it's also taking a holistic approach to equity. Equity is not just at one point in the research life cycle. Equity should be embedded from the agenda setting to the funding decision, and all the way down to output and impacts. And all of that has to be decided and discussed collaboratively from the inception of the research project. It is also in terms of addressing power imbalances and allowing for LMIC leadership and ownership of the research that is carried. If you look at how we could strengthen relationship and research systems themselves, one thing that I think we will never emphasize enough is this two-way learning system. You know, too often the flow of knowledge go in one direction, or we're pretending that it comes both ways. But in a post COP27 landscape, for instance, if you take climate as an example, you know, countries in Africa have had to deal with the impact of climate change for a long time, and they have developed adaptability and resilience. And we do have so much to learn from stakeholders, people who are directly affected, in a way that, you know, we have to learn from them for things that we can potentially adopt in high-income country. So this two-way learning system, I think, really needs to be emphasized. And also the knowledge of the context. Too often we're not aware of the context, or we don't take time to look at context and real priorities. We don't conduct research for the sake of research. If we want impactful research, we have to be mindful of priorities of stakeholders on the ground, and how we can really address challenge-led research. And then when it comes to the very nitty-gritty of partnership in terms of budgeting and in terms of governance and IP, I think we have to make sure that we adopt a common language, and that we respect that we all come from different contexts, in different framework, with different resources. We had, as part of this ARIN International Conference, we had a side event this morning on the very specific topic of equitable partnership, where my colleague, Dr. Alice Chadwick Al-Ali, presented our good practice document. And Joel, you were one of our panelists alongside Juliet and Johannes, so it's good to see you again. And if you will allow me, I would just like to mention a few takeaway points that I had this morning to share with this wider audience. And I think the main point, I'm looking at my note, and it was about the language that we use. And you're right, you know, I'm often unsure about what the right language is. So this morning I spoke about global North and global South. I'm currently at the World Science Forum in Cape Town, where the topic is science for social justice. So, you know, equity and all of that is very much at the heart of what we're discussing. And a lot of people speak about global North, global South, high-income country, low-income country. So it's just adopting this language that is also a step towards decolonization. And what we discussed a lot this morning was about the fact that while equitable partnership is an integral part of Partnerships for the Goal, it is often a peripheral topic, or something that we don't quite know how to address or how to implement. And the last thing, and I will leave you with that, is the need to strengthen the voices of the marginalized, to involve community in the decision-making process, and to reach a point where research is truly transdisciplinary. We can't just stay in our ivory towers. We need to listen to the need, to the priorities, and to involve the right stakeholders from the beginning. That's my take on it. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Maggie. And you're bringing this perspective about power imbalances. I think it's resonating more and more. Andy mentioned the idea of you know, power issues, challenging power. We're talking about equitable partnerships, and you're mentioning that looking at equitable partnerships is not about, you know, it's not the end in itself. It's an enabler to us talking about decoloniality, which I think is really a conversational point. And when talking about inclusion, I carried a question from earlier in our conversation about inclusion. You know, when you're talking about inclusion, how much of it is actually just, and how far do you go? I think the conversation is getting more interesting when you're reflecting on these things. And then the question about language, and you know, thinking about the same perspective, I'm curious whether you have just a quick response, Maggie, about this aspect of marginalization, inclusion, resilience. How much of it can actually be enough? Just a quick reflection in it.
I think, yeah, it's the question you left us with this morning, Joel. You know, how much is, to be honest, I don't know what to answer, because I think there is so much to do in that field, that anything we will do to have inclusion of marginalized people, or to listen to indigenous knowledge, little by little, we just have to change the culture. And I do know that it's changing academic culture is an undertaking, but I think we can just keep pushing people to do it and showing the benefit of involving indigenous knowledge. That's my best take at it.
Indeed. It's a progressive step, it's a step by step. Maybe we'll get that
exactly
sweet spot eventually, but it's a step by step. Thank you so much, Maggie, for your reflection.
I think just to add, I think one thing that really helps as well is to be able to reflect on cases where we have involved communities and it has led to a step change in what we would have achieved without that community. So I think case study or changing the narrative is something that often speaks to people.
Great. That actually bridges us to the next question, where we are bringing in Fatin, I think. Fatin, if you're here, Samara, Fatin is the, I think it's Fatin, is a co-chair of the United Arab Emirates Climate Change Research Network and a professor of environmental science at the American University of Sharjah. She's co-chairs in the Climate Change Research Network, establishing the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment, and aims to facilitate dissemination of knowledge and advanced development of research collaboration, for which the UAE Ministry of Climate Change acts as a secretariat. And Dr. Fatin, if you're here, welcome to this conversation. And for you, I'm curious, Maggie is leaving us with a comment that this is progressive. We're talking about expertise. In some sense, the capacity in there, and you are in this space. How would you say, decolonizing expertise and the global knowledge space builds us towards resilience? Over to you, Fatin.
All right, hello, and thank you so much for the invitation. My apologies for the voice. I'm going through a really tough cold at the moment, or flu, or whatever it is.
Sorry.
But I come from a little bit of a mix of different backgrounds. So I grew up in Puerto Rico from a Palestinian family, actually. Did my schooling in the US and then came here to the UAE for work, right? For my position as a professor. And I've seen a little bit of transition. The UAE is what we can say is a fairly new country. I believe that when a lot of other countries had already started spreading that knowledge and starting their research work and a lot of these ideas, we were still not there. And one of the topics that I saw that was really interesting was the idea of decolonizing knowledge and how do we do this? And just to give you a very simple example, when I started teaching at the American University of Sharjah, I realized that even if we had international specific books, so the specific forms that we had were international books, yet the examples that were given of environmental issues were not international. Were basically specific for the United States, for Canada, for Europe, but there were no examples given for the region. And we know that our conditions are very different. We know that we live in places where the environmental problems that we face here are not the same that are faced in other places. And it became really, I think, an eye-opener for me to be able to look into that, to look into the fact that our students are in a region, in a part of the world where we have very harsh conditions. It is obviously extremely hot weather. We live in a desert region, yet we're looking at examples of freshwater ecosystems. We're looking at examples of something that does not apply to our region. So I think the idea of decolonizing knowledge, that is really important. And we need to start in the basic. We need to go back to the idea of awareness. We need to go back to the idea of education, starting from the young. And that is a topic that I think it was highly spoken about during COP27, the idea of involving the youth and more addition of the youth. And that's something that I really enjoy because I feel like we are not doing enough of it. So definitely the educational systems. I don't think we are there yet. I think that in our case, ministries have to really look into those curriculums. We need to understand what examples are we giving our children in terms of climate, in terms of environmental challenges, in terms of environmental problems. So that I think that is a very simple example. As we were looking into the IPCC reports, for example, for climate, our regions are mentioned, but then specific examples are not given. And specific research is not done in these regions. And I think as part of decolonizing expertise, we need to go to the core. We need to go to those experts that understand what are the challenges that are facing specific communities. And I could tell during COP27 in some of our interventions that some of the African challenges are similar to the challenges that we have here in the Middle Eastern regions, in the Gulf regions. And that is something that I think can be shared. Those examples and those stories can be shared, but we need to, again, go back to specific scenarios. Thinking about the idea of the UAE, for example, the UAE just celebrated the 51st year. It is a fairly new country, and a lot of changes are happening really quickly. If you're familiar with how Dubai has been growing so quickly, if you're familiar about how the country in general has changed from a very simple country to something that is very advanced. And that is what I think that the government, the Ministry of Climate Change specifically, realized that we are not using our resources in the right way, that we have all this expertise that are currently in the country, but we're not using them in the right way, and we're not speaking to each other. And basically that's what the Climate Change Research Network is. If we think about the idea of the ministry was to basically enhance the knowledge resources, looking into adaptive capacity in the UAE and looking at the wider region as well, to be able to respond to climate change challenge. And why they needed to create this network was that they realized that those in governmental entities are not necessarily experts. They have not been here for a long time. They have not been researching like a lot of the researchers in academia has been. So basically it intends to put together all this different knowledge, all these different scientists to find one specific or one common scenario in which they can share those knowledges and those ideas. So that is where we are right now. I believe that countries need to look into, to be able to decolonize knowledge, you need to be able to unify that knowledge. You need to be able to find those expertise. And some of the topics, I think some of the things that have been mentioned, it is the idea of inclusivity and including everybody into one specific topic. And that's one of the aims of the network. It is to look at all of those that are interested. One of the new plans that we have initially, it started just with academics and other scientists within the region as well as governments to have that conversation between climate and policy so that we can support each other when it comes to what do we do. But now we're trying to expand into the idea that we're not only including the academics and the researchers, but we're also including those that are in social sciences, that have that other understanding, that can speak the language of the people, those that are experts into all the different regions, and then the youth. Because if we don't start by educating the youth, then we don't necessarily have anything. So I believe that in order to decolonize expertise, we need to be able to be more inclusive. We need to be able to treat everybody as a community rather than just having experts in every corner of the world or every region, and then use examples that are specific for the region that you're in.
Thanks, Fatina, and bringing this perspective, about contextual examples. Earlier in the morning, I think we also had another conversation that do you have good case studies that we can refer to in the context of decolonizing knowledge and decolonizing expertise in this sense? And I'm curious, in your perspective, when you're talking about this building towards adaptive capacity, that then basically feeds into itself. And I'm looking at the question that Andy is posing on the chat, reflecting on democracy on one side of knowledge, and on the other side on partnerships. And I'm curious, would you say that in that regard of balancing democracy on one side, democracy of knowledge, so that there's more access to it, the what we need to do kind of thing, and how to do it, as Andy is explaining, expertise, what would be the role of expertise in coming from what we want to do to get to how we want to do it, or the other way around?
Yeah, so one of the biggest challenges that we have here, and I think many places in the world, it is the sharing of data, right? And that would be a simple example. So data can give you knowledge, what is happening, what are the conditions, what are the different areas that everybody has looked at. And I believe that that is a challenge that we are still facing. Data about the differences in environmental issues here in the UAE, data regarding air quality, data regarding water quality, it is not easily shared as of yet here. And one of the things that the network is trying to do it is to create a platform that data can be shared. I think we need to be, tend to be a little bit selfish with the data that we are getting into. and we don't want to share. And that's one of the biggest challenges, because as we don't share that data, we're basically just limiting ourselves. And that is the idea, that can we share that data, can we share that knowledge? If we have expertise, can we reach out to them rather than trying to reinvent the wheel? It is already there.
Yeah, thanks for that. In a separate conversation about climate action and national or regional position opinions, there was this conversation that when we start thinking about keeping knowledge a secret because it's proprietary information and not sharing it, whereas some of this information should also already be a public thing, it becomes quite, in climate action and in climate negotiations, then it becomes really a major thing, because it's like we are holding up positions in secret, but really it's already known and we should put it out there in different contexts. Thank you so much, Fatin, for that. And I think we have had a good conversation about decolonizing research in different perspectives. We talk about decolonizing the space for partnerships in research and building towards resilience, and just now about decolonizing expertise. I want to invite Sue to also give us a perspective about decolonizing finances and research. And Dr. Sue Zabo is a Director General of Innovation and Climate Finance at the Global Affairs Canada. She's also she has been in this space of social and economic policy and international development research as part of the IDRC, and as a Chief Development Policy and Finance space in Canada. She has a strong academic foundation in economics and has held leadership positions in policy, programming, and research. Her work, she's traveled over 50 countries. She's very good to give us perspective from that experience, and also has provided first-hand experience on different wide range of issues, including women entrepreneurship, health, innovative financing, and governance. Dr. Sue Zabo, if in your perspective here, you're bringing you on board to help us understand, in your experience, how do we decolonize the finances and resources space for poor resilience? Over to you.
Thank you, Joel, for that very kind introduction. I'm slightly overwhelmed. And thanks to our colleagues as well for the opportunity to be on this important panel. I've been really listening with interest to the different contributions that the panelists have been making. I would first like to acknowledge that I am speaking from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, known to most of you as Ottawa, Canada. But I'm very grateful to be present in this territory and to be humbly considering the journey that my own country is taking as we confront our history and legacy of colonialism. And it's in that spirit that I'd like to offer two themes for the important topic of this session. And because I'm a very practical person, I'm going to illustrate them concretely with some of my own experiences as a public sector funder of initiatives for international development. And I'm hoping that this might suggest some models of how policy research and participatory approaches might be able to create a more equal footing between those who have the resources and the power and those whose voices are often not heard, as we've been speaking about earlier in this panel. So my first theme I'm going to call Agenda versus Accountability. And here I'm going to draw on my experience having oversight of the Think Tank Initiative, which was a 10-year initiative. 5 donor partners funded 43 think tanks in 20 developing countries with core, non-earmarked funding. And I think I'm hesitating there just to let that sink in, because often we deal with project-based funding, not core institutional funding. And what this meant, and this was one of the most significant aspects of the initiative, was that the think tanks based in these countries themselves determined their own policy research agenda on the issues that mattered to their communities and their countries. And again, contrast this to much of donor-funded research, which often sets out specific research topics, often driven by the latest concerns in donor countries themselves. and too often also including or being even driven by international researchers in whole or in part. But we also need to acknowledge, and this is the accountability part, donors themselves need to be accountable to their publics, often our taxpayers, and that in turn underlies the expectations of accountability of those we fund. So the think tank initiative expected accountability. It was unrestricted funding after all. And each think tank was expected to show progress on the institutional development path it had set out along strategic, operational, and governance lines. But again, what I want to emphasize is here also the pathway was set by the institutions themselves. They documented their starting points. They documented where they wanted to go as credible sources of policy research in their respective countries. So is this taking us as far as that democracy of knowledge that some of the other panelists have been speaking about? I would say we probably still have a long way to go, but I think again, what I want to leave you with on this is institution-based rather than project-based research funding. So my second theme I'm going to call pathways versus results. Here I'm going to draw on an experience when Canada was developing its new 21 to 2026 climate finance commitment, an important sum of $5.3 billion that we've committed to climate finance. And what we did is we reviewed global evidence, we consulted with over 300 groups and individuals. And there's one consultation that really stuck with me, and that was with our national indigenous organization representatives. With them, we talked a lot about the importance of engagement, participatory approaches in policy and program development, ensuring that indigenous peoples, including indigenous-led institutions, were given voice, rather than having others speak on their behalf. We had a very frank dialogue on the often linear manner in which donors measure results, logic frameworks, et cetera, and what was considered expertise and evidence, the values that underlied that. By contrast, they pointed out that an indigenous lens could bring in a more multifaceted way of understanding climate change, including aspects related to the well-being of people and ecosystems. And what was also emphasized was the importance of building relationships along the way as a necessary and desirable element. And again, in contrast to the way that donors often structure competitive, objective, and seemingly arm's length processes, as though, that actually really changed the power dynamic involved. So I've been presenting these rather deliberately as agenda versus accountability, pathways versus results, because they're so often seen that way. But what I'd like to leave in this conversation is the notion that building more equitable partnerships requires us to think about agenda and accountability, pathways and results, and to be able to determine those together and to be thinking about how that actually will be the way to take us forward. Thank you.
Indeed, thanks, Sue, and having that comparability of things, that dichotomy sometimes comes with its own pressure to really have a balance of it. And that's a very useful conversation you're having, which ideally also I was tempted to ask about. There's a question on democratizing knowledge, but I'm also thinking about commercializing knowledge as part of this funding for research. Is commercializing knowledge and therefore embedding commerce or rather business within knowledge system a step towards diversifying funding for decolonizing research?
So I'd like to think about that in multiple ways. I mean, first of all, I think that the challenges facing the global community are so vast, we can't operate anymore in the silos of government here, civil society here, business over here. We have to find ways to work together and to figure out how, especially because public resources will never be enough. So a lot of my work over the last 5 years has been looking at how do we actually engage the private sector? We know that there's a lot of private sector participants who, partly because of the individuals who are putting money into their funds, want to actually not just make a profit, but also be operating in a more socially desirable space. There's a lot about ESG and greenwashing right now. So we know it's actually good that there's that much attention being paid to it. But I think that there are opportunities to bring the private sector in, but this is where local knowledge becomes absolutely critical. We need to make sure there's the researchers on the ground who are actually able to monitor what is happening and be able to tell the story, good, bad, and ugly.
Indeed, indeed. Being able to share experiences and tell stories across board will be really an integral system. Of course, we are talking about funding diversity and funds diversification, and therefore the private sector is right for, they have joined the conversation looking at different ways of diversifying technological solutions. Thank you so much, Sue. We have been talking about this. We started with knowledge and learning systems, discussed about production of that knowledge in different contexts, moved into the technology side of things, expertise side of things, and then funding. Now, I want to bring in Andrew Sims. Andrew, if you're here.
Yes, Joel.
Yeah, Andrew I'm trying to get, Andrew is a coordinator of the Rapid Transition Alliance, and we've been working with Andrew in different things around just transitions. And he is also an author and a political economist and an activist, co-director of the New Weather Institute, and assistant director of Scientists for Global Responsibility, a research associate at Sussex, University of Sussex, and a fellow for New Economics Foundation. He has his books as an author includes The New Economics, Cancel the Apocalypse, and The New Path to Prosperity, Ecological Debt, Cancel Apocalypse, and Do Good Lives Have to Cost the Earth? Oh, interesting. Do Good Lives Have to Cost the Earth? And Andrew, we're bringing you on board to give us a reflection about decolonizing policy and research systems for resilience building, and what, looking at the informal formal knowledge systems, what's the room for this? What's the room for this formal knowledge system dynamics when it comes to decolonizing policy and research system, especially towards resilience? Over to you, Andrew.
Joel, thank you so much, and thank you also to Fatin and Maggie and Andy and David and Sue. And I hope I will give a slightly different complementary perspective about how research relates to I suppose it's the world of action research, how it relates to advocacy and campaigning. I've spent a lot of my time working in on issues of micro and macroeconomics and how they either do or do not enable resilient communities to flourish, but very much in the context of achieving a rapid and just transition. And I have to thank Andy as well for getting all the caveats about the position of middle-aged white males engaging in this debate. And I loved his ideas about disrupting upwards. I think that's my day job, upward disruption. The Rapid Transition Alliance speaks in terms of evidence-based hope, and I think the plurality of approaches we like to underpin by thinking of obviously transitions in very much the plural, and we try to look at enabling conditions. My particular interest, I say, is in how research informs advocacy and campaigning, and I speak from the peculiar situation in the United Kingdom when the attempts in the mainstream to control the language means that even if you use the term decolonizing, you are invalidated in the mainstream by being accused of being woke. And I always think this big debate about what is woke and not woke is a very odd one, because for me the opposite of woke is being asleep, and we really should not be asleep at the moment given the challenges that we're facing. Also, I like this idea about there's a wonderful Swedish author called Sven Lindqvist who wrote a book which was exploring the colonial experience, in which he retrod the steps of Joseph Conrad's Hearts of Darkness. And he writes in his book, which it was his own travel odyssey, the conclusion he came to is that you already know enough, so do I. It is not knowledge we lack. What is missing is the courage to understand what we know and to draw conclusions. And for me, that spoke to what Andy was talking about in terms of now how we need to address power and culture. And we're in a situation in which we know that effective community resilience is very context specific, but that is up against systematic inequality, undifferentiated economic ideologies, and sort of the economics of extractivism. So checking that sort of systematic understanding at the start, I'm trying to bring that into the way in which civil society, especially in the UK, engages with these issues, has been an issue for us, merely reminding people of the context in which we're working, the axes of culpability, responsibility, and how we learn about how we move forward, who owes who and who learns from who, are axiomatic and central to everything that we're doing. So starting with that big sweep, even though we're talking about ultra-specific community resilience, it means we're building upon these decades of global structural injustice, inequality, and exploitation. I've worked over many years on the issues of unequal trade and unfair debt, and on asymmetric aid, and the sort of issues around the extractive economy and the undemocratic international financial institutions who preside over what has been for decades effectively a neo-colonial model of structural adjustment. And for me, in terms of how this might apply, I look for ways in which we can introduce these issues so that they can become alive within the advocacy that is engaged in by especially civil society in Europe and the global north. And one clear example, I thought it was interesting to bring in some of these examples so we can see how this manifests around the specific. In the context of the campaign for the abolition of unpayable debt that was known as the Jubilee 2000 campaign, which was it was a very collaborative campaign, North and South, and led to the Heavily Indebted Poor Country Initiative, the HIPC initiative. But in the context of trying to establish and describe the unfair sources of that foreign debt, sovereign debt crisis, we tried to introduce language around ecological debt and how ironic it was that this huge and undemocratic system vested in the international financial institutions used the leverage of debt for a form of neo-colonial structural adjustment, while the existence of an ecological debt, a climate debt, had no meaningful mechanism to deliver any form of restitution, or to deliver, in fact, any form of process of change within the global north to address its overconsumption, which was driving the problem. And now we still live with that and have only just got to the point of acknowledging the issue, perhaps with the death and damage debate around COP27, but we still are only talking about this sort of mythical 100 billion of climate finance. So there you have an example where it's sort of played out in the asymmetric world of things which are made to happen on the economic side, where you have the financial institutions and things that we know we need to achieve, where it's all just pledges and exhortations. Another way in which I think this plays out in a very active sense is around the issue of migration and immigration, and the way in which the sort of the self-image of the self-image in the West and in the UK, we come from a kind of a colonial perspective in which our imagination of our role in the world is of there having been colonial empire building entrepreneurs, and you contrast that with the way in which the dismissive language used around sort of economic migrants. And I see this as very much a kind of projection of the huge inequalities which are denying ultimately the circumstances to be put into place for us to be able to build resilient communities at the grassroots level in a really fundamental way. And I think another expression of this is the way in which, in the debate around the options that we take, we still have an attitude in which the global north, I speak from a UK perspective here very much, believes that we're still the fundamental relationship that sits behind the achievement of resilient communities is one in which we are bringing knowledge to the wider world. We have things to teach people. And I think what we tried to do with the Rapid Transition Alliance is to showcase the reverse, the way in which we are being led in many important ways by the global south. And I think of examples, for example, in at the South American context, where they're trying to reimagine and put into law a different relationship between society and the biosphere, with things like the Mother Earth law led by activists ultimately in Bolivia. I look at examples in Ecuador where you see the rights of nature being placed in the constitution, and the Buen Vivir movement as well, which is reimagining what resilient communities mean and their relationship to the natural world at the local level. I think of the work led by the Maori people in New Zealand, who were integral in creating rights for nature in terms of the Wahanganui River being placed into law, giving them the rights that a person would have. And I think also in terms of COP27, where our Prime Minister was dragged sort of very begrudgingly, it must be said, having initially said he wasn't going to go before being potentially upstaged by the former Prime Minister, decided he would go, talking about UK leadership on this issue. And when in fact you can turn around and look at the situation in which on renewable energy leadership, for example, Kenya provides over 80% of its electricity from renewable energy. And there are many countries like Ethiopia, Uruguay, Costa Rica, Paraguay, Bhutan that have 100% renewable energy, when the UK only manages about 38%. So when we look at this issue, what we try to do is to try and find ways in which our imaginations can begin to unpick the image of the world which has been made with our colonial, our sort of culturally, colonially rooted imaginations, and begin to kind of pull at threads which can allow people to realize the degree to which the images that come to mind when we think about resilience, when we think about solutions, have been controlled by that, and try to show that there is a different story, that there is a fundamentally different story, and try to find a language with which we can talk about that. So I will, I'll finish speaking now, and I'll put a couple of links into the chat where you can see some of the stories of change where we try to give these different perspectives from a range of different perspectives, looking at those issues around nature, looking at those issues around the movement of people, and some of those historical issues around the sort of the economic injustices. So that was just sort of a really, really quick wrap to say that I'm interested in how we can take this issue of decolonization and find a language of examples, which means that we can make it relevant to the activism and the live campaigns which are seeking to redress some of those injustices, some of those structural inequalities, and some of that sort of the extractive nature of the economy which has landed us in trouble in the first place, and how there is so often leadership from below which goes unrecognized. I'll finish there, Joel. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. And I think your closing statement could be leadership from below. And I think that's a very useful comment to have, and reflecting in how you're talking about upward transition. And I think that's really a strategic idea around decolonizing how we look at things, particularly the perspective that, I know the Rapid Transition Alliance is also trying to translate some of the stories into local or more understandable contextual languages, which I think it's in the up and up in terms of providing further content, and therefore leading by example in different contexts of decolonizing knowledge and learning systems. At this point, there are a couple of questions in the chat, and I'm wondering whether there are anyone wants to voice their questions before we go to one reflection, and then we move to the papers. I think there was a question to Sue from Andy, really bringing this conversation about result versus pathway dichotomy. Andy, do you want to just less than a minute. Just give us the question, and then we hear maybe in less than a minute from Sue.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry to take up time in a way. My voice has had quite enough airing, but no. So I'd welcome you elaborating on that contrast, if you want to, between a results focus and a pathways focus. I wasn't sure I understood it properly, and there may be colonial dangers in one possible interpretation of that, but I'm sure I've got it wrong, and welcome you putting me straight.
Sure. And I think here what I'm talking about is so often we want to define the end results and the, what are the KPIs that we actually need to achieve. So that often then results in quantitative kinds of measurements, number of beneficiaries, number of, tons of GHGs removed from the atmosphere. But what both our work when discussing with Indigenous representatives, and I will say very importantly on our work in gender, what has also been emphasized is that the way you get there is also very important. So you can get the results, but if you've not changed norms or behaviors along the way, you have achieved so much less. And again, particularly, I would say we've got some really great examples in our work on gender and climate, where what we're trying also to do is change the way women as workers, as participants, as entrepreneurs in the climate economy, potential for them participating in low carbon activities. That is where we also need to start thinking about how do we have a very different view, and we influence the pathway to get there, and we fund the pathway to get there very deliberately. I hope that helps.
Thank you. It does.
Yeah. Thanks for that response. Yeah, there's another question in the chat, but in the interest of time, I'll invite the panelists to respond to a question or thereabout, and then give us a call to action. So I think it's sort of an ambush here. One statement, call to action from your point of view. I think we'll start from Fatin. Fatin, there's a question for you about how do you, what would be the entry point for youth engagement in coming to decolonizing research? And as you respond to that and any other question from the chat, please do give us a call to action very briefly.
Yeah, definitely. We have a responsibility, and we need to be the ones that are in the research area. We need to be the ones to give that opportunity. And I see it every day. A lot of people, a lot of the youngsters are very interested in contributing, are very interested in learning. And if we don't give them that opportunity, then they're not going to be able to continue and bring the message. So definitely, we need to be accountable. We need to open those doors and those opportunities for the youth.
Thanks, Fatin. Then perhaps Maggie, if you're there, just what would be your call to action?
I think to start implementing those equitable partnership and finding ways to actually measure is a grand word, but to actually see what is done in terms of implementation. So stop talking about it, look at all that exists and put it in place.
Great, it's time to not just start, but continue beyond the conversation into implementation. All right, great. Sue, quick call to action.
Thanks. So I'll make a call to action of continue to work with us bureaucracies. I know donors are often very frustrating because we seem to be so slow. But as we start to change our own practices, given the amount of public resources we can bring to bear, it's kind of like turning the Titanic. So please continue to think about us as one of the allies, but push us to get there.
Thank you, Sue. And then there's a question that has just popped up from Salome. Salome, do you want to voice your question? There are two questions in there, but maybe just briefly. And if there's a panelist that you're more likely to respond to your question, you think? You ask, how does the past live in the present, with a backdrop that we keep referring to the injustices to be rooted in coloniality? So how does the past live in the present? How do we, I think maybe this could be a good question for Andy, because Andy mentioned about this coloniality and looking into the past and cultural sensitivity. And then what can we do to this decoloniality, with this decoloniality lens to really up and up what we could say, the past living in the present? Are we haunted?
That's a thorny one, Joel. I think others here. In a way, the paradox, I mean, it's at this flocking motion, acting horizontally, acting politically, being open about that, not trying to claim to map the territory in the way colonial power maps what it's going to appropriate and stratify and extract from, but instead behave in a completely different way. So the medium is the message. We're behaving in a different way, but unfortunately, me taking so much time repeating that is itself part of the problem, I think. But yeah, but thank you though for asking.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think it's a continuous conversation that we'll proceed having about this and how to break that. Andrew, just your call to action.
I suppose my call to action is the same one I would always mention in a research setting, is we find ourselves always needing to, we're torn between always needing to do more research, always having imperfect information, acting in circumstances of kind of flux and uncertainty, but needing to act. For all the things that we've talked about, this kind of knowledge of the creeping destabilization of the climate and all the difficult problems it's going to have. So I suppose is we always need more research, but we always have to act on what we have available at the present time. And I think specifically for this conversation, the challenge I take on is trying to keep the issues that we've been talking about on the surface of the debate, because you cannot underestimate the degree of denial in the mainstream economic and political establishment that issues around the colonial legacy and the importance of decolonization is an issue at all.
Thank you. Quite reflexive there, looking into ourselves. Yeah, thank you all the panelists for being part of this conversation. I really appreciate your time in this. And as we continue in this conversation, I wanted to invite two reflections. One is from Charles. Charles, if you're here, Charles leads the engagement and policy space within ARIN. And I wanted Charles to give us just a quick reflection on these complexities we've been discussing in terms towards decoloniality, referring to aspects of the expertise, to policy, research systems, funding. What are these complexities related to how we can strengthen linkages between communities and policy and decision-making space? Charles, just a quick reflection on this.
Thank you, Joel, and thank you for the eminent speakers who have really highlighted. I don't want to repeat that. And it's good that we are coming in at a juncture where Africa, we are really looking at evidence and especially influencing policy and practice. And the question that we ask ourselves as African researchers and policymakers is, what is the nature of evidence? And also evidence are we getting from the research? And what is the kind of community that you are engaging in? And from our perspective as an engagement and policy specialist, is the question that we caught, especially with engagement with the African group of negotiators and the high-level policymakers, is what is their presence in designing, especially the research project that you're targeting to generate that evidence. So the relevance of evidence is very key. Relevant evidence is very key, and especially if it's co-produced with the high-level policymakers, but also the private sector and the local communities. And one also key factor that you have tried to address here, and still a key issue, is that our communities are heterogeneous. They are not homogeneous. And you look at Africa, especially Sub-Saharan Africa, we have got the islands, the deserts, the semi-arid and arid areas. And to address especially their needs, there is that kind of really the urgency to co-create and harmonize our research agenda, especially towards the support from the west or the north, but also the domestic-led research agenda. Another key lesson that we can learn, especially from the discussion and of course, really drawing down to Africa, is the investment that we need to take into consideration, especially the local voices. And we look at the COP27 talking about the transition, the inclusivity. And thanks for the speakers who have spoken. We have engaged especially with the UK CDR, the STEP Center in Africa, and especially really discussing how do we facilitate and develop those methodologies that really amplifies the voices of the most vulnerable, but also give them the leadership space, because the local communities, we have to create space for them, but also the Africa researchers and policymakers to really drive and provide that leadership, which we are already seeing, having our colleagues like Joanne sitting as an advisory member in the UK GCRF, but also engaging with the Global Affairs Canada. That is a good positive message. So the question that I'm posing to you that we need to look beyond in decolonizing research policy and practice processes is the investment towards addressing the needs of these heterogeneous local communities, where we are anticipating that the Paris Agreement, the Sendai Framework, the SDGs are trying to address their real issues. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Charles, for that reflection. Really, one of the things I'm taking from this is, even within the context that we're looking at, low income, low middle income, or even the context of marginalized and vulnerable populations and people, there is still heterogeneity, and therefore context has to be applied within this heterogeneity. Thank you so much, Charles. I wanted to invite also Dr. Mary Rariera, if she's still here. She did post some reflections on the chat. Marie, if you're there. No, I think thanks for those reflections. Yes, go ahead, Mary.
Yes, thanks. I think I'm really, I like the discussions that are going on. And if I remember, one of the speakers said, we really cannot work in silos. And partnership remains, as we said, really, we have to work as partners. And again, I think the discussion that right now, as we are on this platform, we are engaged as the global North and the global South. And I think the co-creation of this knowledge, co-creation of this epistemology is very important. And I just say that as we think of projects, programs, let's sit together, conceptualize, think of the approach, work through it, including the aspects of funding. So basically, I feel that as the global North, global South, we need to identify who are the key stakeholders, determine how we can engage in research. And we can also quickly, who are the immediate stakeholders and whom can we engage on the long term? What are the key issues that we need to address and keep in mind? So I really like the discussions that are going on in terms of setting the agenda as both the global South, then looking at the accountability, the two pathways that were talked about, the agenda setting and accountability. Let's all work as partners to address global issues that affect us. And I think Charles talked about heterogeneity. It is true that like in Kenya, you have the semi-arid issues within the northern Kenya is different from the highlands. So we really need to think of situated knowledge. What is the local context of those issues and address issues within the context of that area that we are dealing with. That is what I would like to put across. But I really like the discussions that are going on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you for all the reflections in different contexts. I think we all agree that this conversation has to go on. I often get excited about this conversation on decoloniality and really putting the message out there. So I might go on and on with this conversation and having different thoughts coming in. Really appreciate it. We want to move to another section of this program, and now is to really reflect about some of the book products that are coming up, and some of the chapter authors are in the room. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of the book, I'd like to invite, I think that's Gagandeep Singh, if you're here.
Yes, I'm here. Thank
Yes,
you.
please.
Thank you so much.
Just
Yeah.
give us a reflection about how your publishing is actually getting into the space of decolonizing research. And as you give that also a call to action in the end, and we'll invite the book authors. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, ACTS. Thank you, ARIN, for inviting me for brief comments. Of course, I come from, my name is Dr. Gagandeep. I had the books editorial science and technology team for Taylor and Francis in sub-Saharan Africa, while I'm based in India. So again, two very contrasting but very much similar communities between Africa and India. So I have been handling this for the last couple of years. So I just want to make few points here. I think decolonizing the content is one thing, and then making it publishable enough so that it travels worldwide is another thing. So I think as a publisher, as a responsible publisher, I'm not getting into my commercial pitch. I'm not going to make any commercial pitch, but very generically, making the content discoverable, making it travel worldwide, and creating awareness. So these are the three things as a publisher we need to work on. I think recently I was in a Cambridge University program in which they said that Africa generates less than 1% of the world's research published in highly visible, mainly northern journals. There is still a big struggle for recognition, being seen, or maybe in funding, high impact journals, promotions, accolades, or aligning with the fundable kind of research. So I think what as a publisher we are working is our emphasis is more on demystifying the concepts, encouraging people to publish more in terms of books, maybe in journal papers, training the workforce, because publishing is very much a very evolving sphere. It does not involve that you just send a manuscript to a publisher just to print. It involves many things. For example, African researchers, they need to know about open access, open research, alt text for accessibility. And for that, publishers really need to step in. And that's what we are trying to do while we are trying to engage with the Research Impact Network. So I think what we plan to do is to create awareness on webinars, very generic webinars or interactive sessions on how to write, how to avoid rejections, how to make yourself more discoverable. Of course, we want the local knowledge to travel worldwide. It may involve developing thematic book series and different things. So what my call to action is that choose a suitable publisher who can really travel, not us, any publishers, but I think make yourself more aware on how you are producing the content and how you are making it more publishable and more discoverable in the world. And the world really needs to know what is happening here in the Africa. So that's my call to action. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Joel. Thank you.
Thank you, Gakandi, for giving that insight. We need to make the scholarship that we are getting from these decoloniality issues and our publication content-worthy, discoverable, and having the space for us to publicize what we do. Finally, in the spirit of publicizing, we have two book discussants who have submitted, and well, rather their chapters are almost being published, I should say, within our conversation on decoloniality. And these are Dr. Adriana Moreno and Father Francis Magana. So Dr. Moreno is a postdoc fellow in education sciences, and also has been for more than 15 years working with local and indigenous communities as a practitioner and as an activist. As a researcher, she is interested in knowledge co-creation and mutual learning in a transdisciplinary setting. She is currently in the LIR South Initiative project in Bolivia. And then after that, we'll hear from Father Francis Maganya, who's from Kenya. And he's the director of the Institute for International Interreligious Dialogues and Islamic Studies at Tangaza University College. He has a PhD. He's a PhD student in social transformation at Tangaza University, and his areas of specialization are security and sustainable peace. So for these two, we'll just give them about 5 minutes for them to share their perspectives when it comes to the books that the book chapters that they put together in reflecting in different contexts of decoloniality. I think we'll start with you, Adriana. Just in 5 minutes, give us a reflection on the scholarship you've developed around this place. Adriana?
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Joel. Thanks for this kind introduction and for this invitation, and also for inviting us and making all this possible to write this book chapter and putting together all this work. Was very interesting process. And for today also was very interesting discussion that I've been following with a lot of interest in the different positions. And well, regarding to the discussion, I know that the idea it is more talking about what is indigenizing the research and indigenizing these research spaces. And I'm very agree with all the things that has been said now during these almost 2 hours. But for me, a key question that comes out from these reflections is where are those voices? Where are the indigenous voices in this space? We have been listening to a lot of very important people from Canada, from Europe, from England. But I think there is a lot of people that we need to listen to a little bit more and bring them to these spaces. And for me, this is the call for indigenizing the research space. And this is my call for action, I would say, in the same discussion that we have been, or you have been doing a few minutes ago. If we really would like to indigenize this space, we need to bring not only the indigenous people, their bodies, but also their knowledge here into these discussions, and not only including them and using this knowledge and their knowledge and their what they have been producing and trying to stress in different ways in different spaces. But more, it's I think we need to think more about them as a knowledgeable people, yeah, not an outsiders of the academic spaces or the political spaces. But we need to bring them in board to think together with us and to try to bridge, to make bridges that can bring together those different positions, and those different knowledge can really help in building a better world, a more plural world. So, and for that, of course, we need to start ourselves putting in a different positions, yeah, in a position of ignorance and being more human, yeah, more humble, and then that way we can start a different conversation. And this is what I was trying to do in my book chapter, trying to see the production of knowledge from a different perspective, but becoming and calling the academics to become more more engaged with the different struggles of the communities. So action researchers that are really committed to the struggles of the communities that we are working with, and not only thinking about our privilege and how we use this knowledge and these struggles for our own benefit. So if we really would like to make a change, we need to start reviewing our position as academics. This is a little bit what is about my book chapter. Thanks.
Thank you, Adriana. Really bringing the question about the fact that we work with these communities doesn't mean they do not have information, and in the steps towards that, we also need to have basically self-reflexivity, because we need to involve in this step. Then we'd like to also to hear from Father Innocent, if you're here. Innocent Magana.
Please unmute yourself, Innocent. Sorry, Innocent. Your microphone is not working.
Yeah, sorry. I was saying thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this, and also be part of the contributors to the book, which is going to come up, where I was looking at the African philosophy of Ubuntu in this discourse of decolonization of knowledge and for sustainable development. I would like, first of all, to thank all those who have spoken before me with this interactive session. And what I would like to take away from this conversation is that knowledge is with the community, and that is very, very critical. Yeah, and what also I've gathered from those who have spoken from a global North perspective is a kind of introspection of the colonial attitude, which could still be seen in some of way with dealing with the global South. So from an African perspective, I was looking at the concept of the decolonization of the mind, because this education system that we have received is still marked by a Western system of education, and we are still struggling to acknowledge the richness of the knowledge that we have. So it's indigenous knowledge, a knowledge that is produced from within, which has not been so much recognized. And our brother Gandhi, if I'm saying correctly, say, how can we make ourselves known, to the global community of what we are producing from the global South. So it's basically, I went from a historical perspective, starting from the whole movement of the late 19th century and development of social sciences and anthropology, and the philosophy which was behind that of colonization, commerce, Christianization, and civilization, whereby the explorers and the missionaries said, we are bringing civilization to Africa or to the world, okay? And that still affects, and that undermined somehow, let's say, and up to today, the way, the global South, and especially Africans, have less value. They value less what is produced from within, and we are looking at methodology from the West. You know, everything has to come from the West, and that's also has impacted also the research and the knowledge. Even when you want to invest in research, then sometimes and most of the time dependent on funds which come from from outside. So that is the issue. But for me, basically, is about from an African perspective, is about a shift, a mental shift, whereby we need to acknowledge that we have something to offer, yeah, something to offer, which we have not valued. We have not valued so much. So basically, my paper is more or less addressed to to an audience which is from the global South, which tend to depend more on the knowledge that is coming from outside, exogenous knowledge. And I'm in an institute which has been founded by white missionaries, and I still struggle to see how we can bring, you know, the value of local cultures, local knowledge into the teaching within our own institutions, and it's still really the struggle. So it's from that perspective that I brought the African philosophy of Ubuntu in the context of the decolonization of knowledge. And in fact, as I'm reading and researching, actually, I found that in South Africa, or that part of Africa, Ubuntu, a theory, is becoming a theory within the theories of social sciences. Just before coming to this conference, I was another symposium on the Utu, yeah, and I was telling them that, I mean, when even the West is valuing what we have, we as the Africans, we do not value the riches that we have. So I agree that the knowledge is within the community. There is riches and richness in the indigenous knowledge. Yeah. So if we want to talk about sustainable, you know, development, then taking into account the knowledge that is within the community, the local community, is key for sustainable development. Just to finish, we were talking about peace among the Pokot in one part of the Kenya, and one of the peace activists talked about an experience where an elderly lady managed to stop, you know, violence, cattle raiding, and so on, because the mother, that's all the lady, used a symbol which is powerful among the Pokot, where they put a belt around their waist as a sign of protection. So when the young people or the men, they go for cattle raiding or fighting, then the mothers, they put that around the waist. But these women are tired of seeing their children being killed and so on. So she stood among the men and he said, she was about 60, who is above 60 among the men who are here? All of them were young, yeah? And she said, from now on, I said that you are not going to fight anymore. And if you want to go to fight, I'm going to tell your mothers to remove, not to put the belt, yeah? Because that belt is a sign of protection, which means if they do not put that belt, then you go, you are killed, that's your problem. And that convinced the men not to go into cattle raiding. So there are, I mean, that's one example among many other examples in many fields. This is in the field of peace building, yeah? But in many areas, we can find vast resources from within the community, and that's where we can. And that a philosophy of Ubuntu can help us into decolonizing knowledge for sustainable development. Just in a nutshell, what is about the article, the book chapter. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Innocent, for those remarks on the chapter. And I think we all now look forward to having this book and all the chapters in there really reflecting on different contexts. We have in there the theory side of decoloniality, reflections on that. We have case studies in there, like what Innocent just mentioned. We have context of practice and practitioners, which Adriana reflected on, and it's ideally a book that is worth reading in the coming year. And in all that regard, I want to thank all the panelists again for taking their time and for being part of this conversation. We started the conversations and the panelists and the presentation from Andy, giving us this reflection about, the perspective on plurality, pathways towards space for decolonizing knowledge and learning systems. We've had about conversations about, thinking about leadership, institutionalization, and decolonizing power in that regard. And also talked about in length in terms of using partnerships as an enabler towards decoloniality and talking about equitable partnerships in that regard. And ideally, conversation is, it should not go just be a buzzword, but it's also something that's associated with actions and resources. We then talks about contextualizing different ideas and therefore bringing case examples that enhance expertise in the field of decolonizing activities, and then moved towards talking about funding and looking at the private sector as a key funder that will enhance research and action in decoloniality. We have the catchphrase upward transition on one side from Andy, but also from Andrew. So Andy and Andy really reflecting on upward transition in different contexts of one side research, the other side also looking at research and practice. We then talked about co-production of information and looking at contextual research agenda, reflections from Charles, giving us the context on how we can move forward and have heterogeneity in the different contexts of decoloniality that we are having. We've also reflected broadly on the context in which we think about discovering our research being discoverable. So thinking about our scholarship, when you write, it goes a long way. And then we've talked about enhancing the voices of the indigenous and recognizing in the end that knowledge, indigenous knowledge is knowledge, and the people there have actually information, and knowledge is with the community. And with that, I really thank all of you for being part of this conversation. And I'd like to hand this over back to Victoria Chengo, who will lead us to the last bit of this conversation. Thank you very much and have a lovely day, lovely evening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Onyango, for taking us through that very interesting session, all through from the panel discussion and also looking at the case study book chapters that have been presented very ably by Adriana and Innocent. Really good work there, really great insight. I think I'll be repeating myself if I just, just go over some of these real key points that have come across and is summarized by Joel as well. Really, so many punchlines that I think I've put down together. Let's push the conversation. Let's keep talking. Let's publish. Most importantly, there's a lot to learn from each other. Let us keep talking. Partnership is key, as has been highlighted. And as we do this, let's ask ourselves the key questions. How do we equalize the knowledge? How do we decolonize our understanding on these very key issues? And most importantly is to ensure that sustainability is a collective action, as has been really highlighted and mentioned. I could go on and on. There's so much things to say, but really, I want to give this opportunity to give us a wrap up of the conversations, the way they began, from us looking at from the first day, what just transition is, and trying to look at the case studies and trying to kind of look at how communities are building resilience towards that just transition up to today, where now we are looking at how to decolonize the knowledge towards that just transition. So allow me to pass over the mantle to our director, or Dr. Johannes Atela, the director for the ARIN network, who's going to just give us a few summaries on those key points across the few days, and give us the next steps on how do we proceed and how do we move this conversation forward. And as he speaks, I'm going to just put up a slide that's just going to show us how you can connect us with us, and push the conversations forward. So over to you, Dr. Jones.
Thanks. Sorry, my voice is yeah, becoming a bit lost after 3 days, very active conversation on a fundamental issue on how we can make our business responsive to the poor. And our business, in this case, we are researchers, we are policymakers, we are knowledge producers. And we do all this, as it was said by Andy, that the whole framing of why we do all this is because of sustainable development. And when we talk about sustainable development, it's about the communities, it's about the poor, it's about goal number one, poverty reduction. So it's amazing really that we've had this fantastic discussion for the last 3 days. And I think we have, tried in one way or the other to bring some of the issues, some of the fundamental issues to the surface. And I want to agree again that, this kind of conversation, they are not necessarily solutions to some of the complexities that we face, but certainly, they help to bring the discussions, they help to bring the issues onto the surface, so that these particular issues can get the attention of the most different responsible people. So I want to take this opportunity not to go so long because I think our time is over, but just to thank everybody for being part of this process. We started on day one where we were trying to define just transition for Africa, and we did agree that just transition is indeed very vital for Africa. And it's needed for Africa. But again, we acknowledge that it's a very complex process. It's not a very straightforward. So there is need for a lot of work to be done to be able to be clear in terms of what we mean by just transition. The second day, we looked at ways in which pathways through which we can build resilient communities through just transition processes. And one of the key, messages that was coming is the fact that our community systems are, very complex, and there are a lot of matrices that involve the processes through which, decisions that are made are actually interlinking with these particular communities. There are different, privileges that different groups of people, have to be able to influence what happens to these communities, whether it's funding, whether it's research. So the big question is, how do we, ensure that those privileges are actually opened up so that the underprivileged are able to really, pick into or are able to benefit or, equitably be supported with information, with knowledge, with resources that they need. And of course, speaking about climate change, we just came from Egypt, where a fundamental decision on loss and damage was made. And therefore, there are a lot of discussions on really how do we ensure that we are able to decolonize, or we are able to open up those spaces of privileges. Conversations around whether just transition is about vulnerability or it's about responsibility. So where should we look at it from in that sense? A number of things came out from yesterday, but that again has led us to this very fundamental discussion today about decoloniality. And I think one of the takeaways that I get from this, the big question that I think we need to continue thinking when we think about Africa, and because from the Africa Research and Impact Network perspective, our main focus is to try and consolidate voices across Africa, consolidate evidence from the various scattered places that they exist. But one fundamental thing that comes out is that our communities, even as we talk about them, they're relatively very complex. And this complexity is something that needs to be properly understood in whatever interventions that we put in place. The design of the programs, the decisions that are made are supposed to take into account these particular complexities. But the fundamental question again is, if you're talking about decolonizing processes and systems to enable resilient communities, are these communities ready? Are they, ready to be able to receive, the decolonialities that we are pushing to them? Where are we decolonizing to? Are the systems ready? And more broadly, look at Africa, really. This is a fundamental question. If you talk about North, South, Africa or wherever, are we having enough systems that are able to receive decoloniality? And think about it again from the perspective of the local communities. How can we empower local communities so that they are able to receive the decoloniality or the sort of opportunities that we're trying to push through the decoloniality debate? How can we ensure that they are empowered to be able to engage on an equal level when it comes to partnerships? How can we ensure that we create those structures even at the local level so that these conversations are not just about us as researchers and policymakers talking about them in meetings and representing the voices of local communities from a third party perspective? Because we talk a lot about, how communities are supposed to be included, as they're supposed to be supported, how they are vulnerable. But the fundamental questions remain around where are these communities? Can't they also talk, for themselves? And what do we need to do to ensure that these communities are able to speak for themselves? So those are conversations that we are going to continue having. And I think in our next conference, which is coming up next year, we will be trying to look at much more about the community structure. How can we really profile the community and ensure that we understand the communities in a better way and to create spaces and opportunities through which these communities can be engaged and can be supported when we are talking about decisions that are inclusive, partnerships that are equitable, financial systems that are really supportive. So we need to think about some of those issues. Otherwise, I want to again echo and say that we are really very grateful. It has been a wonderful discussion, 3-day discussion. And I want to take this opportunity to say that we don't take this for granted. Your presence here in December on a Friday after so many meetings across the year is not something we take for granted. I know many people would have been on holidays or going for Christmas, but we want to say that whatever you've done, your presence and working with us to discuss some of these issues is a significant contribution to the African communities. It's a significant really support that basically is what we need to continue seeing. If we're talking about global partnerships and partnerships for the global goals, we are actually seeing this through this particular conference. So we want to thank you for your time and for your insights, which have been very, very thought-provoking. And finally, just to highlight a few things. Number one is that we will have our next conference next year, and we are hoping that the next year's conference, we can do it on a physical kind of space so that we're able to bring as many people to a particular space so that these conversations can really be grounded on a very realistic way. So if we reach out to you, to be able to, or to ask for your partnership, to partner with us in delivering this, I really request that, you open your doors so that we can engage in developing that. There are a number of products that are going to emerge from this work. We are going to produce a report from the discussions that have taken place since Wednesday, and we will be sharing this. And momentarily, we've also been sharing the video recordings of the discussions, so it is possible for you to continue following. Joel mentioned about the book. We have a couple of books lined up, and this is also a discussion we're also having again with Gangdeep, a colleague who was just here around, from the Taylor and Francis, on how we can really support the African young researchers to be able to profile the knowledge, because that is the only way we can support the local communities to be able to bring up the evidence from the different contexts and be published in platforms that then can attract the attention of those who who need to see some of those issues, that we continue to use that process to put issues on the surface. So that would be very critical. And this book on decoloniality will come out sometime in January, and we'll be able to share it with all of you moving forward. Otherwise, as Victoria said, feel free to really follow us. We have a Twitter handle. We have our YouTube page as well as Facebook page, so that we can continue this particular engagement sustainably and moving forward. Otherwise, last and not least, may I take this opportunity from the Africa Research and Impact Network to really wish you a very, very Merry Christmas and a fantastic 2023. And may God bless you, and thanks so much for your partnerships and collaboration. We don't take it for granted. I want to take it back to Victoria. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. I really cannot repeat what you said because that's really critical. But just before you leave, I want us to just take a virtual selfie. So if you can, please just have your video on so that we could just take a screenshot of the screen. And then we can just use this to just, and please just smile so that our technical team can just capture that. As I keep saying, again, thank you for your time, even for staying over after the time elapsed. So as I'm speaking, I'm sure that ARIN is capturing that. And thank you. And see you again this coming year. Have a good break. And yeah, all the best. And thank you for your time again. We're good, ARIN? Yeah,
Thank you.
That's good. Bye-bye, and thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank
See
you.
you. All right, bye-bye.